In the spring of 1945, somewhere along the collapsing Eastern Front of Nazi Germany, a group of 23 women and children huddled in the basement of a bombed-out farmhouse, listening to the sound of boots marching closer. They had been hiding for 3 days, surviving on nothing but rainwater and the last scraps of bread they'd carried from their burning village. The Soviet army was advancing from one direction, German patrols were sweeping through from another, and these mothers, some holding infants, others clutching the hands of terrified 6-year-olds, knew that being caught meant almost certain death or worse. But what happened next, in the span of one surreal hour on that muddy forest road, would become one of the most quietly heroic and deliberately forgotten acts of the entire Second World War. A single Wehrmacht officer, a man who wore the eagle and swastika on his chest, made a decision that would save every one of those lives while putting his own neck directly on the chopping block. And the method he used to do it was so strange, so brilliantly improvised, that even 70 years later, historians who stumble upon the fragmentary records of that night struggle to believe it actually happened. The officer's name was Captain Albert Schiller, a 34-year-old logistics coordinator from Munich, who had spent most of the war far from the front lines, managing supply routes and troop movements through Poland and East Prussia. He was not a member of the SS, not a true believer in Hitler's vision, but like millions of other Germans, he had done what was expected of him. He wore the uniform, followed orders, and kept his head down. By April of 1945, Schiller had witnessed enough atrocities to know exactly what kind of machine he had been serving, and the weight of that knowledge had transformed him into something hollow and sleepless. His unit had been tasked with clearing the roads ahead of the retreat, which in practice meant rounding up any civilians who might slow the column or pose a security risk. That evening, as dusk settled over the dense pine forest near the Polish-German border, Schiller's patrol came across fresh tracks, small footprints, the drag marks of exhausted bodies, leading off the main road and into the trees. His sergeant, a hard-eyed man named Vogel, insisted they follow the trail and deal with whoever they found according to standing orders, which everyone understood meant execution on sight. Schiller agreed to lead a 4-man team into the forest, and within 20 minutes, they had surrounded the farmhouse basement where the women and children were hiding. The mothers didn't scream. They were too frightened to make a sound. They simply pressed their children against the dirt walls and waited for the inevitable. Schiller descended the narrow stone steps, and his flashlight beam swept across their faces. A girl no older than 8, clutching a rag doll, a woman in her 60s holding twin infants, another woman with a blood-stained bandage wrapped around her head. He counted 23 souls in total, and he realized in that instant that if he radioed back to Vogel, every single one of them would be dead within the hour. But Schiller also knew that if he simply let them go, if he walked back and reported the basement was empty, Vogel would investigate personally, and Schiller himself would be the one facing a firing squad for dereliction of duty. He needed a third option, something that would satisfy his sergeant without condemning these innocents, and he needed to think of it in the next 60 seconds. What Schiller did next required not just courage but a kind of theatrical genius that bordered on madness. He turned to his men, 2 young conscripts barely out of their teens, and an older corporal named Baumann, who had always struck Schiller as decent, and he began to speak in a loud, slurred voice, laughing too hard at his own words and swaying on his feet as if he'd been drinking for hours. He pulled a flask from his coat pocket, the one he actually kept filled with water, and he took a long theatrical swig before passing it to Baumann with exaggerated camaraderie. He ordered the men to search the basement thoroughly, but as he stumbled around, knocking over crates and tripping on loose planks, he was actually positioning himself between his soldiers and the huddled civilians, using his body as a shield while maintaining the performance of a drunk officer who could barely stand upright. Baumann caught on first. His eyes met Schiller's for just a fraction of a second, and there was a flicker of understanding. The 2 young conscripts, confused and uncomfortable, followed Schiller's lead as he began to joke about how the basement was clearly empty except for rats and ghosts, and how they were wasting time that could be spent getting back to camp and finding real schnapps. Schiller then did something even more reckless. He ordered his men out of the basement, and once they were back on the forest path, he radioed Vogel and reported in his most convincing drunk voice that the tracks had led to an abandoned structure, that they'd found no one, and that he had personally searched every corner while his men secured the perimeter. He added, and this was the masterstroke, that he had confiscated a stash of Polish vodka from the farmhouse, and that he and his team had perhaps celebrated a little too enthusiastically, but that they were now heading back and would be ready for duty after a few hours of sleep. Vogel's response crackled over the radio, a mix of disgust and dark amusement, but he accepted the report. Drunk soldiers were common enough in those final chaotic weeks, and Vogel had bigger concerns than disciplining one logistics officer. Schiller had bought the women and children one night, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed to give them a real chance to escape. Under the cover of darkness, Schiller returned alone to the farmhouse basement. He told the women in broken Polish that they had until dawn to move, that they needed to head west through the deepest part of the forest where the patrols were thinner, and that if they traveled fast and stayed off the roads, they might reach the advancing American lines in 3 or 4 days. He handed over his own map, his emergency rations, and the last of his water. He told them that if they were caught and interrogated, they should say they overpowered a drunk German officer and stole his supplies. It would make the story more believable and shift the blame away from intentional aid. Then, without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement, Hauptmann Albert Schiller climbed back up those basement steps and walked into the night, knowing that he had just made himself a traitor to the regime he served, and that if the truth ever came out, his life would be worth nothing. The women and children vanished into the forest, and against all odds, 21 of them survived the war. To understand why Albert Schiller made the choice he did on that April night, you have to go back to the world he grew up in. A world that seemed stable, predictable, and utterly ordinary until it wasn't. Schiller was born in 1911 in Munich, the second son of a postal clerk and a schoolteacher, and his childhood was marked by the quiet rhythms of middle-class Bavarian life, Sunday church, summer hikes in the Alps, and the unshakable belief that Germany would recover from the humiliation of the First World War. He studied engineering at the Technical University of Munich, graduated in 1933, just as Hitler consolidated power, and like many young men of his generation, he joined the Wehrmacht not out of ideological fervor, but because it was simply what was expected. Military service was a duty, a rite of passage, and in those early years before the invasion of Poland, it seemed almost harmless, just uniforms, drills, and the comforting fiction that Germany was merely reclaiming its rightful place in Europe. The war, when it came in 1939, swept Schiller along like everyone else. He was assigned to logistics because of his engineering background, and for the first 3 years of the conflict, his war consisted mostly of paperwork, supply manifests, and the coordination of rail shipments through occupied Poland. He never fired a shot in combat, never stormed a trench, and for a long time he convinced himself that his role was morally neutral. He was simply making sure German soldiers had food, ammunition, and winter coats. But by 1942, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, and the true nature of the occupation became impossible to ignore, Schiller began to see things that shattered his carefully maintained illusions. He witnessed SS units herding Jewish families onto trains bound for destinations no one was supposed to talk about. He saw Polish villages burned to the ground as collective punishment for partisan activity. He watched as orders came down from Berlin that treated human beings as obstacles to be cleared, not lives to be protected. The breaking point came in the winter of 1943, when Schiller was temporarily stationed near the Lublin district in occupied Poland. His unit had been tasked with organizing the transport of confiscated grain from Ukrainian farms back to Germany. And during one of these operations, Schiller stumbled upon a makeshift transit camp where Soviet prisoners of war were being held in conditions that could only be described as deliberate extermination through neglect. Thousands of men, skeletal and filthy, were packed into open pens with no shelter, no medical care, and barely enough food to keep them conscious. Schiller watched as bodies were loaded onto carts each morning like cordwood, and he realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't collateral damage or the unfortunate chaos of war. This was policy, this was intentional, and he was part of the machine that made it possible. He filed a report to his commanding officer, requesting improved conditions for the prisoners, citing Geneva Convention obligations, and the response he received was a written warning that further inquiries into matters outside his jurisdiction would be considered insubordination. Schiller stopped filing reports after that. He stopped asking questions. But he also stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, and he began carrying a flask, not filled with schnapps, but with water, because the act of drinking helped calm the shaking in his hands. He was not a resistance fighter, not a saboteur, not a hero by any traditional measure. He was simply a man who had seen too much, and who was waiting, perhaps without even realizing it, for a single moment where he could do something that mattered, something that might balance the scales just a fraction against all the evil he had witnessed and enabled through his silence. He had no grand plan, no network of fellow conspirators, no illusions that one good deed would redeem him or change the outcome of the war. By April of 1945, with the Reich collapsing and the Eastern Front dissolving into chaos, Schiller's unit was in full retreat through the forests of Pomerania, trying to stay ahead of the Soviet advance while maintaining some semblance of military order. The roads were clogged with refugees, German civilians fleeing westward, desperate to escape the Red Army's reputation for vengeance, and mixed among them were the remnants of other populations, Polish families, Ukrainian laborers, Jewish survivors of the camps who had somehow managed to stay alive and were now caught in the crossfire of the final battles. The Wehrmacht's official policy was brutal in its clarity. Anyone who slowed the retreat, anyone who couldn't prove their identity or purpose, anyone who might be a partisan or a Soviet sympathizer, was to be dealt with immediately and without mercy. Hauptmann Albert Schiller had been following these orders, or at least not actively resisting them, for weeks. And then he found 23 women and children hiding in a basement, and something inside him simply refused to follow orders one more time. The evening that changed everything began like any other in that final desperate month of the war. Schiller's patrol had been on the road since dawn, moving through the dense pine forests that covered the border region between what had been German Pomerania and occupied Poland, checking papers of refugees and clearing abandoned buildings that might harbor partisans or deserters. His Sergeant Vogel was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had long ago abandoned any pretense of mercy or moral complexity. The world, in Vogel's view, was divided into those who followed orders and those who ended up in unmarked graves, and he had no intention of ending up in the latter category. Vogel had made it clear that any civilians found off the main refugee routes were to be considered enemy combatants or security threats, which in practice meant immediate execution. Schiller had watched this policy play out 3 times in the past week alone, and each time he had stood by silent and complicit, telling himself that intervention would only get him killed without saving anyone. But that evening, as the patrol came across fresh tracks leading into the forest, small footprints, the kind made by children's shoes, mixed with the deeper impressions of women carrying heavy loads, something shifted in Schiller's calculations. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 2 years of witnessed atrocities finally reaching a tipping point. But when Vogel ordered him to take a team and hunt down whoever had left those tracks, Schiller felt a strange clarity settle over him. He had spent the entire war as a passive observer, a man who told himself that survival required compromise and that small acts of kindness in the margins were the best anyone could hope for in such times. But those calculations suddenly seemed like the rationalizations of a coward, and for the first time since 1942, Albert Schiller felt something close to courage stirring beneath the layers of numbness and fear. He volunteered to lead the search party himself, choosing his team carefully. 2 teenage conscripts who were too green to question orders, and Corporal Baumann, a 40-year-old father of 3, who Schiller had always sensed possessed a similar quiet disgust with what they had become. The hunt was brief and efficient. The tracks led straight to the ruins of a stone farmhouse, about half a kilometer off the main road. Its roof collapsed from an artillery strike weeks earlier, but its basement still intact. Schiller approached slowly, his weapon drawn, and he could hear the sound of suppressed breathing coming from below ground. The desperate, controlled silence of people who knew they had been found. He signaled for his men to surround the building, then descended the narrow stone steps into the basement, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. What he saw in that beam of light would stay with him for the rest of his life, Not because it was horrific or grotesque, but because it was so heartbreakingly ordinary. A grandmother with silver hair holding 2 infants. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, with a bandaged head wound and eyes that had already accepted death. Children clutching each other, too frightened to cry. 23 people who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when history turned monstrous. Schiller knew exactly what Vogel expected him to do. He knew the protocol, the justification that would be written in the patrol log. Suspected partisans, potential security threat, eliminated in accordance with standing orders. He knew that if he simply radioed back and reported the situation, Vogel would either come himself to finish the job or order Schiller to do it and report back with confirmation. Either way, these 23 people had about 10 minutes left to live, unless Schiller did something that would almost certainly end his own life as well. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. He could save them and die, or he could kill them and live with the memory forever. What made his decision remarkable was not that he chose to save them, but that he realized survival and death were not the only 2 options. There was a third path, narrow and insane, that required him to become an actor, a liar, and a traitor all at once. In that moment, standing in the basement with his flashlight beam moving across those terrified faces, Albert Schiller made a choice that had nothing to do with grand moral philosophy or political resistance. He simply could not pull the trigger, could not make the radio call, could not add 23 more bodies to the already uncountable millions. And so, with no plan beyond the next 5 minutes, he began the performance that would save their lives. He turned to his men, forced a stupid grin onto his face, pulled out his water flask and started acting like the kind of drunk, incompetent officer that every soldier in every army has encountered and learned to tolerate. He swayed, he laughed too loud, he made crude jokes, and he began the most dangerous improvisation of his entire life, convincing his own men that their commanding officer had found a stash of liquor and was too intoxicated to follow through on their grim orders. The performance had to be perfect, and Schiller knew he had only one chance to make it believable. He stumbled dramatically against the basement wall, nearly dropping his flashlight, and began speaking in a deliberately slurred voice about how they had hit the jackpot. Some Polish farmer must have hidden bottles down here before fleeing, and wasn't it about time they had a bit of luck after weeks of miserable retreat? He pulled the flask from his coat and took a long theatrical drink of the water inside, then wiped his mouth with exaggerated satisfaction and passed it to Corporal Baumann with a conspiratorial wink. Baumann hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting Schiller's in the dim light, and in that instant an entire conversation happened without words. Baumann understood, not the full plan because there was no full plan yet, but he understood that his captain was asking him to play along with something dangerous and necessary. Baumann took the flask, pretended to drink, and handed it to one of the young conscripts with a forced laugh. The 2 teenagers were genuinely confused, looking from Schiller to the huddled civilians and back again, clearly unsure what was happening, but too junior to question a superior officer who seemed to be having some kind of breakdown. Schiller used their confusion to his advantage, turning his back on the women and children and addressing his men as if the basement were completely empty, except for the 5 of them. He made a show of kicking over empty crates, searching corners with exaggerated thoroughness, all while positioning himself between his soldiers and the civilians, using his body as a casual barrier. He kept up a running commentary about rats and ghosts, and how they were wasting valuable drinking time chasing shadows through these god-forsaken ruins. One of the conscripts, a boy named Werner who couldn't have been older than 17, pointed hesitantly toward the cluster of people pressed against the far wall and opened his mouth to speak. But Schiller cut him off with a loud laugh and a slap on the shoulder, declaring that the kid was seeing things in the dark and needed to get some rest. The critical moment came when Schiller had to get everyone out of that basement before the illusion cracked. He announced in his drunken voice that he had personally confirmed the structure was clear, that there was nothing here but broken furniture and disappointment, and that they were heading back to report to Vogel. He herded his men up the stairs with the practiced authority of a functioning officer, barely hiding beneath the mask of intoxication, and once they were back outside in the cold April evening, he made the radio call that would either save 23 lives or end his own. His voice was slightly slurred but not incomprehensible, as he reported to Vogel that the tracks had led to an abandoned farmhouse, that they had found evidence of recent occupation but no actual civilians, and that he had discovered several bottles of what appeared to be homemade Polish vodka in the basement. He added, with just the right note of sheepish confession, that he and his men had perhaps sampled the vodka a bit too enthusiastically to confirm it wasn't poisoned, and that they were now returning to camp and would be fit for duty after a few hours of sleep. The seconds that followed were among the longest of Schiller's life. The radio crackled with static, and he could picture Vogel's face on the other end, the hard eyes, the contemptuous sneer, the constant suspicion of weakness or dereliction. If Vogel decided to investigate personally, if he brought additional men to verify the report, if he questioned any detail of Schiller's story, then everything would unravel within the hour. But Vogel's response, when it finally came, was exactly what Schiller had gambled on, a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. The sergeant's voice was laced with contempt as he acknowledged the report, made a crude joke about logistics officers who couldn't handle their liquor, and ordered Schiller to get his drunk ass back to camp and sleep it off. There was no suspicion, no demand for verification, because drunk soldiers in April of 1945 were as common as mud and lice, and Vogel had bigger problems than babysitting one incompetent captain. Schiller and his men made their way back through the darkening forest, and he maintained the drunk act all the way to camp, stumbling occasionally, laughing at nothing, creating a performance that his men would remember and that would serve as his alibi if questions were ever asked. Once they reached their bivouac area, he dismissed the patrol, made a show of collapsing onto his bedroll, and waited. He waited for 2 hours, lying perfectly still while the camp settled into its nighttime routine, listening to the sounds of exhausted men sleeping and the distant rumble of artillery from the Soviet lines growing closer with each passing day. And when he was certain that no one was watching, Albert Schiller rose silently in the darkness, picked up his map and his emergency rations, and began the walk back through the forest to give those 23 people the only thing he had left to offer them, a chance to run. The walk back to the farmhouse took Schiller nearly an hour, moving carefully through the darkness without a flashlight, relying on memory and the faint moonlight filtering through the pine canopy. Every snap of a branch beneath his boots made him freeze, listening for patrol sounds or the voices of other soldiers who might be wandering these woods. He was technically absent without leave, and if anyone spotted him moving alone through the forest at this hour with a pack full of supplies, there would be questions he couldn't answer. But the night remained quiet, except for the distant thunder of Soviet artillery, a sound that had become so constant over the past weeks that it barely registered anymore as a threat, just the background noise of a dying regime. When he finally reached the ruins of the farmhouse, he descended the basement steps as quietly as possible, and he could hear the sharp intake of breath as the women realized someone was coming back. They had spent the past 2 hours in terrified silence, not daring to move or speak, convinced that the drunk German officer's act had been exactly that, an act designed to lull them into a false sense of security before the real killing began. Schiller announced himself in whispered German, then switched to his broken Polish, trying to communicate as quickly and clearly as possible that they were not in immediate danger, but that they had very little time. He spread his military map on the dirt floor, using his lighter to illuminate the terrain, and he traced a route with his finger, west through the deepest part of the forest, avoiding all major roads and known Wehrmacht positions, aiming for a sector where American forces were rumored to have advanced in the past 72 hours. He told them it was roughly 60 kilometers, maybe 4 days of hard travel for women and children moving on foot, and he marked the locations of 3 streams where they could refill water containers and 2 abandoned barns where they might shelter if the weather turned. He gave them his emergency rations, 6 tins of preserved meat, a bag of hardtack biscuits, and a small medical kit with bandages and iodine. He emptied his canteen into their containers and told them to boil any water they found, even if it looked clean, because typhus and dysentery were killing as many people as bullets in these final weeks of chaos. The oldest woman in the group, the grandmother with silver hair who had been holding the twin infants, reached out and gripped Schiller's wrist with surprising strength. She spoke in Polish, words he only partially understood, but her meaning was clear enough. She was asking why, asking what would happen to him, asking if this was some kind of trap. Schiller didn't have a good answer because he wasn't entirely sure himself why he was doing this, why he was risking a firing squad for people whose names he didn't even know and would never see again. He simply told her in his halting Polish that she needed to move now, that she needed to keep the children quiet and stick to the densest forest cover, and that if they were captured by any German forces, they should say they had escaped from a transport column and should never, under any circumstances, mention that a Wehrmacht officer had helped them. He emphasized this last point with as much urgency as his broken language skills allowed. If they were tortured or interrogated, the story had to be that they overpowered a drunk soldier, stole his supplies, and fled into the woods. His survival, if he had any chance of survival at all, depended on this story never connecting back to a deliberate act of treason. Then Schiller did something that surprised even himself. He took off his officer's insignia, the small metal eagle and swastika pin that marked his rank, and he pressed it into the grandmother's hand. He told her to bury it or throw it in a river, that it was worthless now except as evidence that could get them all killed, but that if by some miracle they survived the war and wanted proof that this encounter had actually happened, that single piece of metal would be that proof. It was an insane gesture, the kind of thing that only made sense at 3 in the morning in a bombed-out basement, with the world ending just beyond the tree line. But the old woman understood. She closed her fist around the insignia and nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have, and then she began organizing the other women and children for the journey ahead. They moved with surprising efficiency, gathering their few possessions, distributing the rations Schiller had provided, and wrapping the youngest children in whatever extra layers of clothing they could spare. Schiller watched them prepare for perhaps 5 minutes, and then he turned and climbed back up those basement steps for the final time. He didn't say goodbye, didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement, didn't look back to see them file out into the forest. He simply walked away, retracing his path through the darkness back toward the camp where his men were sleeping, and where Sergeant Vogel would be waiting with the dawn and new orders for another day of retreat. Albert Schiller had just committed an act of treason against the Third Reich, had handed strategic supplies to potential enemy civilians, and had deliberately failed to execute standing orders regarding security threats. By any military standard, he had earned a bullet in the back of the head. But as he walked through those silent woods, listening to the artillery grow louder in the east, he felt something he hadn't experienced in more than 2 years. He felt like a human being again, like someone who had made a choice that mattered, even if no one would ever know about it, and even if it changed nothing about the ultimate outcome of the war. 23 people were moving through the darkness behind him, heading west toward an uncertain future, and that was enough. The women and children moved through the forest like ghosts, using every skill they had learned during months or years of running and hiding. The grandmother, whose name was Zofia Kowalska, took charge immediately, organizing them into a tight column with the strongest women at the front and rear, the children sandwiched safely in the middle, where they could be watched and silenced quickly if necessary. They traveled without speaking, communicating only through hand signals and gentle touches, and every 100 meters or so they would stop completely, listening for the sounds of patrols or vehicles or dogs. The forest was their ally and their prison. The dense pine canopy hid them from aerial observation and muffled their footsteps, but it also disoriented them, made navigation nearly impossible without the map Schiller had provided, and harbored its own dangers in the form of abandoned minefields, unexploded ordnance, and the occasional patrol from either side of the collapsing front. They covered perhaps 8 kilometers that first night, moving at the agonizingly slow pace dictated by the youngest children, and when dawn began to break through the trees, Zofia found them shelter in a dense thicket of undergrowth where they could rest invisible from the nearby road. The days that followed became a blur of exhaustion, fear, and small miracles. They rationed the food Schiller had given them with ruthless discipline, half a tin of meat shared among 23 people, a single hardtack biscuit broken into pieces, small enough for the children to chew without choking. They found water where Schiller's map had indicated, boiled it over tiny fires built in deep holes to hide the smoke, and moved only during the hours between dusk and dawn when patrols were less frequent. On the second night, they heard a firefight erupt less than a kilometer to their south. The distinctive crack of German rifles mixing with the heavier reports of Soviet machine guns, and they spent 4 hours lying flat in the mud, barely breathing, while the battle raged and then faded into silence. On the third day, one of the younger women, a girl named Katarzyna who was barely 19, developed a fever from an infected wound on her leg, and they used the last of Schiller's iodine trying to clean it, knowing that if the infection spread to her bloodstream, she would die and there was nothing any of them could do about it. But they kept moving, driven by a combination of terror and hope that Schiller's information had been accurate, that there really were American lines somewhere ahead of them, that this nightmare forest would eventually open onto something resembling safety. They lost track of time, couldn't remember if they had been walking for 3 days or 5, couldn't be sure anymore which direction was west, because the sun never penetrated the canopy enough to give them reliable bearings. The children stopped crying not because they felt safe, but because they had exhausted their capacity for tears, and the women stopped asking questions about whether they would survive because the answer was obvious. They would survive or they wouldn't, and talking about it changed nothing. What kept them going was not optimism or faith, but simple momentum, the animal refusal to lie down and die when movement was still possible, and the memory of a drunk German officer who had given them this chance, even though doing so had probably signed his own death warrant. On what they later calculated was the 4th night, they heard something different in the forest ahead. Not German voices or the rumble of Wehrmacht vehicles, but American accents, the unmistakable sound of English being spoken with that particular flat Midwestern twang that none of them had ever heard in person, but that they recognized from before the war, from films and radio broadcasts when the world had still made sense. Zofia made the decision to approach, knowing it was a gamble. They had no papers, no identification, nothing to prove they weren't spies or infiltrators, except their obvious exhaustion and the fact that they were traveling with infants and children. She walked forward slowly with her hands raised, calling out in the few English words she knew, and within seconds they were surrounded by American soldiers from the Third Army's advanced reconnaissance units, men who looked almost as tired and filthy as the refugees themselves, but who didn't point their guns with the casual murder that had become standard in the German zones. The Americans gave them food, real food, more than they had seen in months, chocolate bars and canned peaches and white bread that seemed impossibly soft and clean. They were processed through a temporary refugee station, interviewed by intelligence officers who wanted to know about German positions and troop movements, and eventually transported to a displaced persons camp near the town of Hof, where they would spend the next 6 months waiting for the war to officially end and for the even slower process of finding surviving family members or sponsorship to emigrate. Out of the original 23 who had hidden in that farmhouse basement, 21 made it to American lines. Katarzyna died of her infection on the 5th day, and one of the twin infants, a boy named Jakub, succumbed to pneumonia during the journey. But 21 lived, and they lived because a Wehrmacht officer named Albert Schiller had chosen to become a traitor for exactly 1 night, had chosen to risk everything for strangers he would never see again, and had given them a map and enough food to cover 60 kilometers through hell. Back at the German camp, Albert Schiller woke on the morning of April 21st, to the sound of artillery that was noticeably closer than it had been the night before. The Soviet advance was accelerating, and the entire Wehrmacht position in this sector was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours, orders came down to abandon the current bivouac and retreat another 30 kilometers west toward what remained of the defensive line. Schiller moved through the chaos of breaking camp with mechanical efficiency, packing his minimal belongings and helping coordinate the loading of supply trucks, all while maintaining the persona of a slightly hungover officer who had embarrassed himself the previous evening, but was now back to dutiful service. Corporal Baumann caught his eye once during the morning routine, gave him the slightest nod of acknowledgement, and then looked away. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said, but Schiller understood that Baumann knew exactly what had happened in that basement and had chosen to become complicit in the deception. Sergeant Vogel, however, remained a threat that shadowed every moment of the next 72 hours. Vogel was not stupid, and while he had accepted the story about the drunk patrol and the empty farmhouse, he had also developed a survival instinct that made him suspicious of anything that deviated from expected patterns. On the 2nd day of the retreat, as they marched through another nameless village that had been shelled into rubble, Vogel approached Schiller with a casual question about whether any of his men had mentioned seeing civilians during that forest patrol. Schiller felt his heart rate spike, but kept his expression neutral, asking why it mattered given that they had found no one, and the entire sector would be in Soviet hands within a week anyway. Vogel studied him for a long moment, his eyes flat and calculating, then shrugged and walked away. But Schiller knew he was being watched now, that any further deviation from protocol would trigger a more serious investigation, and that his margin for error had shrunk to nothing. The retreat continued for another week, a grinding westward movement through the smoking ruins of what had once been the eastern provinces of the Reich. They passed columns of refugees heading in the same direction, families with everything they owned piled onto carts and wagons, old men and women who could barely walk being carried by younger relatives, and everywhere the smell of smoke and death and the approaching end of everything. Schiller saw other patrols executing civilians on the flimsiest of pretexts, suspected partisans, looters, anyone who looked at a German soldier the wrong way, and he understood with absolute clarity that what he had done in that farmhouse basement was not just an isolated act of mercy, but a fundamental rejection of the machine he had been serving. He had crossed a line, and there was no crossing back, and the only question now was whether he would survive long enough for that choice to mean anything beyond his own conscience. On April 29th, with the Soviet forces less than 5 kilometers behind them, and American units reportedly closing in from the west, Vogel's unit received orders that made Schiller's blood run cold. They were to establish a rearguard position at a river crossing, hold it for 24 hours to allow the main column to retreat, and then withdraw if possible, or fight to the last man if necessary. It was effectively a death sentence disguised as a tactical order, the kind of pointless sacrifice that was becoming common as the Nazi leadership demanded that every meter of German soil be defended with German blood. Vogel assembled the men and delivered the orders without emotion, and Schiller realized that this might be his last day alive, not because of anything he had done in that farmhouse, but simply because the Reich was consuming its own soldiers in a final spasm of suicidal defiance. He thought about the 23 women and children, wondered if they had made it to safety, wondered if any of them would survive long enough to remember that a drunk German officer had let them escape into the forest. The defensive position was set up in the ruins of a stone bridge, with machine gun nests covering the approaches, and what remained of the unit, maybe 40 men in total, digging shallow foxholes in the rocky ground. Schiller spent the afternoon helping position ammunition and checking sightlines, all while calculating his chances of survival if he simply walked away, deserted his post, and tried to surrender to the Americans before the Soviets arrived. But he knew that deserters were being hanged from roadside trees with increasing frequency, that military police units were roaming the rear areas, specifically hunting for men who had abandoned their units, and that even if he made it through no man's land alive, there was no guarantee the Americans would accept his surrender rather than simply shooting him as an enemy combatant. So he stayed at his post, loaded his rifle, and waited for the battle that would either kill him or prove that he had somehow managed to survive long enough to see the end of this war, and perhaps, if he was extraordinarily lucky, find out whether those 23 people had lived or died in the forest he had sent them into. The Soviet attack came at dawn on April 30th, announced by a barrage of artillery that turned the river crossing into a hellscape of exploding earth and shattered stone. Schiller pressed himself into his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, feeling the concussive waves slam into his chest and shake his bones, and through the chaos he could hear men screaming, some calling for medics, others simply making sounds that no longer resembled language. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours, and when it finally lifted, Schiller raised his head above the rim of his foxhole and saw the Soviet infantry advancing across the open ground in waves, hundreds of soldiers moving with the confidence of men who knew the war was already won, and they were simply collecting the final pieces. Vogel was shouting orders, directing machine gun fire, and for the next 3 hours the German position held through a combination of desperation and the tactical advantage of elevated ground, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they were overrun or outflanked. Around midday, during a brief lull in the fighting, something unexpected happened that would save Schiller's life and doom Sergeant Vogel. A runner arrived from the rear with new orders. The main column had successfully crossed the next river line and established a new defensive position, which meant the rear guard was no longer tactically necessary and could withdraw at discretion. It was the kind of order that in any normal military situation would have been celebrated, but Vogel's face twisted with something close to rage as he read the message. Schiller realized in that moment that Vogel had been counting on this battle, had perhaps even welcomed it because holding a hopeless position and dying in combat was preferable to the alternative that awaited all of them: capture, interrogation, and the judgment that would come when the world learned what the Wehrmacht had done in the occupied territories. Vogel announced to the men that they would continue fighting, that retreat was not an option, and that anyone who abandoned their post would be shot immediately for cowardice. Corporal Baumann, who had been silent through most of the battle, stood up from his position and said clearly and calmly that the orders were to withdraw, that staying here would accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed for no reason, and that he was going to follow the written orders from command rather than Vogel's suicidal interpretation. It was the kind of moment that in peacetime would have resulted in a court-martial, but in the chaos of a collapsing front, with enemy forces pressing from multiple directions, military hierarchy became suddenly negotiable. 3 other soldiers stood with Baumann, then 5 more, and within seconds it was clear that the men were choosing survival over Vogel's death wish. The sergeant's hand moved toward his sidearm, and for a terrible moment, it seemed like the German position would tear itself apart from within before the Soviets finished the job. But then a fresh burst of machine gun fire from the Soviet lines raked across their position, and the decision was made for them. They had to move now or die in the next assault. The withdrawal turned into a running retreat through the forest, 40 men moving as fast as exhaustion and fear would allow, carrying their wounded and abandoning everything that wasn't essential. Vogel came with them, his authority shattered, but his survival instinct intact, and he said nothing as they fell back toward the new German lines 3 kilometers to the west. They were harassed by Soviet scouts the entire way, taking sporadic rifle fire from the trees and losing 2 more men to sniper rounds, but the bulk of the unit made it to the relative safety of the new position by nightfall. Schiller collapsed behind an improvised barricade of sandbags and overturned carts, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle, and he realized he had just survived something he had been certain would kill him. He was alive. The war was clearly in its final days, and somewhere out there, maybe 60 kilometers to the west, maybe safe behind American lines, there were 21 people who had also survived because he had made one decent choice in a lifetime of complicity and silence. That night, as exhausted soldiers tried to sleep in muddy foxholes and the horizon glowed orange with burning villages, Corporal Baumann sat down next to Schiller and spoke quietly for the first time about what had happened in that farmhouse basement 6 days earlier. Baumann said he had 3 daughters back in Hamburg, that he hadn't seen them in 2 years and didn't know if they were alive or dead, but that when Schiller had started that drunk act in the basement, Baumann had understood immediately what was being asked of him and had recognized it as the first truly decent thing he had witnessed any German officer do since 1943. He told Schiller that if they both survived the next few days, if they made it through the surrender and the prisoner camps and whatever tribunals the Allies had planned, he would never speak of what happened that night to anyone, not because he was ashamed of it, but because men who showed mercy in this war had a habit of being punished for it by both sides. Schiller nodded, too exhausted for words, and the 2 men sat in silence watching the distant fires burn, waiting for either the end of the war or the end of their lives, whichever came first. The war ended for Albert Schiller on May 7, 1945, not with a dramatic battle or a heroic last stand, but with a tired American lieutenant accepting the surrender of his unit in a muddy field outside the town of Pilsen in what had been Czechoslovakia. Schiller and the remnants of his company, maybe 30 men left out of the original 80 who had started the retreat 3 weeks earlier, laid down their weapons, raised their hands, and walked into captivity with the strange mixture of relief and dread that characterized every German soldier's surrender in those final days. They were searched, photographed, and marched to a temporary prisoner of war camp that had been set up in a former factory, where they joined thousands of other Wehrmacht soldiers waiting to find out what would happen to them now that the shooting had stopped. Schiller spent the first 3 days of captivity in a kind of numb fog, sleeping 16 hours at a time, eating the American rations that were better than anything he had seen in months, and trying not to think about the future or the past or anything beyond the immediate present. The interrogations began on the 4th day, conducted by American intelligence officers who were methodical and surprisingly professional in their approach. They wanted to know about unit designations, commanding officers, where Schiller had served during the war, what he had witnessed, whether he had been involved in any actions against civilians or had knowledge of concentration camps or war crimes. Schiller answered truthfully about his logistics role, about the supply routes through Poland, about the retreat from the Eastern Front, and he waited for the question about the farmhouse basement and the missing patrol report. But it never came. The Americans had thousands of prisoners to process and limited interest in the minutiae of rearguard actions during the final collapse. They were looking for SS officers, Gestapo agents, concentration camp guards, and senior commanders who might face trial for major war crimes, not logistics, captains who had spent most of the war shuffling paperwork. Schiller was classified as a low-priority detainee, assigned to a work detail helping repair damaged infrastructure, and transferred to a larger camp in Bavaria, where he would spend the next 18 months in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for the Allies to decide what to do with millions of former German soldiers. During those 18 months, Schiller learned fragments of what had happened to the world while he had been locked away. He learned about the full scope of the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, about the industrial scale of the killing that had been happening while he shuffled supply manifests and pretended not to notice. He learned that the drunk act and the 23 people in the basement had occurred during the same week that Hitler committed suicide in his bunker and the Reich formally ceased to exist, which meant that Schiller's small act of mercy had taken place literally in the final days of Nazi Germany's existence. And he learned, through the prisoner grapevine and occasional Red Cross notifications, that Sergeant Vogel had been identified by former prisoners as having participated in the execution of civilians during the retreat, that he had been transferred to a different camp to await trial, and that he had hanged himself in his cell before the proceedings could begin. Corporal Baumann ended up in the same camp as Schiller, assigned to a different work detail, but occasionally crossing paths during meal distribution or evening recreation periods, and the two men maintained their unspoken agreement never to discuss what had happened in that forest. They talked instead about the weather, about their hopes of being released before the next winter, about the rumors of new governments being formed, and which zones of occupation might be more lenient than others. Baumann received word in early 1946 that his wife and 2 of his 3 daughters had survived the bombing of Hamburg and were living in the British zone, and Schiller watched his friend weep with relief in a way that would have been unthinkable during the war years. Schiller himself had no family waiting for him. His parents had died in an air raid in 1944, and he had never married. But he found himself oddly grateful for this absence of connections, because it meant he would not have to explain to anyone who loved him what he had done and failed to do during 6 years of war. Release came in October of 1946, a bureaucratic process that involved signing papers declaring he had never been a member of the Nazi Party, which was technically true, though it felt like a meaningless distinction given everything else, and agreeing to restrictions on where he could live and what work he could pursue. Schiller was given a set of civilian clothes, a small amount of occupation currency, and a train ticket to Munich, and he walked out of the camp gates into a Germany that barely resembled the country he had left. The cities were ruins, the economy was shattered, and millions of people were displaced hungry and trying to rebuild lives from nothing. He found work as a bookkeeper for a construction company that was helping clear rubble and reconstruct bombed buildings, and he lived in a tiny room in a boarding house with 5 other men, and he never spoke about the war to anyone except in the vaguest possible terms. He had survived, which in itself felt like an accusation, and he carried the memory of 23 faces in a basement like a secret that would define the rest of his life. Albert Schiller lived another 42 years after the war ended, dying quietly in 1987 in a nursing home in Munich at the age of 76. He never married, never had children, and worked the same bookkeeping job for 3 decades before retiring with a small pension that barely covered his modest expenses. To his neighbors and co-workers, He was simply another unremarkable old man who had survived the war and never talked about it, one of millions of Germans who carried the weight of those years in silence and who seemed determined to disappear into the anonymity of post-war reconstruction. He attended no veteran reunions, joined no memorial organizations, and when younger Germans asked him about his experiences during the Third Reich, he would give brief, factual answers about logistics and supply chains and then change the subject. But in 1983, 4 years before his death, something happened that brought the story of that farmhouse basement back into the light after nearly 4 decades of silence. A researcher named Rebecca Steinman, working on a doctoral dissertation about civilian survival during the final months of the war, had been interviewing refugees and displaced persons in Israel, Poland, and the United States when she encountered Zofia Kowalska living in a retirement community in Chicago. Zofia, then 89 years old and suffering from advancing dementia, had kept certain memories remarkably intact. And during the interview, she produced a small metal object from a jewelry box, a Wehrmacht officer's insignia, the eagle and swastika pin that Albert Schiller had pressed into her hand in that basement 43 years earlier. Zofia told the story haltingly, mixing Polish and English, sometimes losing the thread and having to start over. But the core facts were clear. A German officer had found them hiding, had pretended to be drunk, had come back alone to give them supplies and a map, and had told them to say they had overpowered him if they were caught. Steinman was skeptical at first, because the story seemed almost too perfectly cinematic to be true. But Zofia had the insignia, and she had documentation showing that she and 20 other refugees had arrived at American lines in early May of 1945, claiming to have escaped from a German transport column. Steinman spent the next 2 years tracking down survivors from that group, finding 12 people still alive, scattered across 3 continents, and each of them confirmed the essential details of the story with remarkable consistency. They remembered the drunk act, the water flask, the map, the warning to never mention the officer's help. Several of them remembered that the officer had seemed utterly exhausted, that his hands had shaken as he marked the route on the map, and that he had left without waiting for thanks or even acknowledgement. Using German military records that had been partially preserved and archived, Steinman was able to identify Schiller's unit and narrow down the possible officers who could have been involved, and eventually she found Albert Schiller's name and address in Munich. She wrote him a letter in 1985, explaining her research and asking if he would be willing to discuss his wartime service, particularly any operations involving civilian evacuations in April of 1945. Schiller's reply came 3 weeks later, a single handwritten page that acknowledged he had served in the area during that period, but claimed to have no specific memory of the incident Steinman was describing, and politely declining any further interview or involvement in her research. Steinman recognized the response for what it was, not a denial but a refusal to claim credit or seek recognition for an act that Schiller clearly considered private and unremarkable. She published her dissertation in 1986, including the full story of the farmhouse basement, and identifying Schiller by name based on the corroborating evidence from the survivors and military records, and she sent him a copy of the finished work. He never responded, never contacted her, and never spoke publicly about the story even as it began to circulate in academic circles and eventually reached German newspapers interested in stories of individual acts of decency during the Nazi period. When he died in 1987, his obituary in the local Munich paper made no mention of the war or the 21 people he had saved, listing only his occupation, his years of residence in the city, and the fact that he had no surviving relatives. The story of Albert Schiller and the farmhouse basement has remained relatively obscure despite Steinman's research and the testimony of the survivors, buried in academic journals and overshadowed by larger narratives of the Second World War. It doesn't fit neatly into the categories we use to organize our understanding of that conflict. Schiller was not a resistance hero or a political dissident. He was simply a Wehrmacht officer who had spent years as a complicit cog in the Nazi war machine and who made one decent choice in the final days when the outcome was already decided and his own survival was in doubt. His act saved 21 lives out of the tens of millions who died, a statistically insignificant number that nonetheless represented 21 individual human beings who got to live and have children and see the world rebuild itself after the nightmare ended. The story survives now in the memories of descendants, in Zofia Kowalska's great-grandchildren, who carry a Wehrmacht insignia as a family heirloom and tell the story of the drunk German officer who wasn't actually drunk, and in the ongoing question of what we owe to the truth about individuals who did small good things while serving fundamentally evil systems. Albert Schiller was not a hero in any traditional sense, but on one April night in 1945, in a basement in a burning forest with the world ending around him, he chose mercy over murder. And that choice echoes forward through time as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, individual human decency remains possible, remains meaningful, and remains worth remembering.